We heard many thoughts about what literature is all about. We heard many thoughts on the coming together of like minds. I would like to share a thought by Italo Calvino in his work, The Uses of Literature. In it, he says, "A classic is a book that has never finished saying what it has to say." Isn't that true? A book that's a classic gives you a new meaning on every read. Each time you read a word, a paragraph, a page, a chapter, it gives you something else to think about, which is where wonderfully curated literature festivals come in. We have our interpretations of the written word. We have our visuals. We have the way we see it. We have the way we hear the author's voice. But anything compare to actually hearing from the author that you love and admire, the author into whose world you have been drawn into time and time again. And that is why we are here today, isn't it? Coming up, we have 5 incredible sessions with multiple incredible authors and equally incredible moderators. I'm using the same adjective because I think that is the most apt adjective, because each one here is truly incredible. Before I tell you what the first session is, I'm going to call on the moderator for the session to ascend the dais. And I'm going to introduce you, the gentleman whom I said I will introduce in parts, where each part is relevant to what area he's going to share with you at that moment. So I'd like to invite on stage the moderator for the first session, Dr. Sanjeev Chopra. As he's coming up, let me tell you more about him. Dr. Chopra holds a PhD in management, besides degrees in law, history, and literature. He's a distinguished fellow of the USI New Delhi, which is a think tank on strategic affairs, and he is also a fellow of the Royal Asiatic Society of Great Britain and a Lakshmi Mittal and Family Fellow at the South Asia Center of Harvard. He is the recipient of the Robert S. McNamara Fellowship of the World Bank and the Hubert H. Humphrey Fellowship at the University of Cornell. He was also a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and has attended the 21st Century Trust Fellows Program at Merton College, Oxford. He has written extensively on policy issues and governance and development interventions in rural development, agriculture, marketing reforms, cooperatives, and farmer organizations. He has been invited to deliver lectures and talks at IIMs, ASCI, the FRI, the IGNFA, and at symposia and conferences across the country. Of course, he has also delivered keynotes at International Cooperative Alliance conferences at Beijing, Abu Dhabi, and Ho Chi Minh City. Let's hear a round of applause for the most illustrious Dr. Chopra. My pleasure, sir. An extensively traveled, eclectically read, widely written, unique, gentle person. When you have seen so much of the world and when you have seen so much of its people, you have had your own unique experiences. And from those arise the ability to truly savor and treasure a select few whose works you adore, whose thoughts inspire you, and whom you would like to have a conversation with. When Dr. Chopra first spoke to me about the festival, the first thing he asked me was whether I knew this author. And from the way he posed the question, one could see how much of love he had for his work. Before I tell you who it is, there is a thought I want to share with you, which is from a book by the author's, one of the author's favorite authors, Rudyard Kipling, from his work Kim. The thought I would like to share, which I believe is very relevant right now, is this. This is a brief life, but its brevity but in its brevity, it offers us some splendid moments, some meaningful adventures. Did that hit the spot, sir? The session that we're about to begin today's festival with is titled The Marathon Writer. I am going to share a bit about him, and you'll know why he's called the Marathon Writer. This author is an Indian novelist, journalist, playwright, and screenwriter. He was born in Madras. He studied at Bishop Cotton School in Bangalore and left to study electronic engineering in the UK when he was but 18 years old. You must correct me if at any point of time my facts go awry. But the thing is this, many of us find a passion and a love, not for what we studied or what we set out to study, but what found us in life. Because this author later switched majors to history and political science at the McGill University in Montreal. While still at university, he began writing for The Guardian and other such newspapers. His first job was as a reporter at the Kingston Week Standard in Kingston, Ontario, and he went to study electronic engineering. He then moved to London, UK, and worked and wrote for The Guardian, The Sunday Times, The Observer, and other newspapers and magazines before shifting base to New York. There, he wrote film documentaries and contributed to the New York Times, the Washington Post, and Cosmopolitan, among others. He currently lives in India, why, as a matter of fact, he's right here with us, and has written for many standard Indian news publications as well. Now, I'm going to share his bibliography. And there it is going to become so clear why he is the Marathon Writer. His first novel was The Marriage. And since then, he has gone on to write The Oblivion Tapes, Lovers Are Not People, The Shooter, Field of Honor, which is semi-biographical, Taj, a novel on Mughal India, which has been translated into 25 languages, Imperial Agent, which is a sequel to Kipling's Kim, The Last Victory, which is Part 2 of The Imperial Agent, Enduring Affairs, 4 Steps from Paradise, which I'm told is semi-biographical, The Arrangements of Love, The Small House, The Taliban Cricket Club, which has been translated into 9 languages, and his latest work, Chanakya Returns, but the list still continues because his young adult works begin now. Children of the Enchanted Jungle, Axis Trilogy, which includes Axis and the Magic Medallions, Axis and the Undersea Kingdom, Axis and the Parallel Universe, and his non-fiction works, Empress of the Taj, In Search of Mumtaz Mahal, My Temporary Son, An Orphan's Journey, Limping to the Center of the World, A Pilgrimage to Mount Kailash, Going Back Home, A Black Family Returns South, The New Savages, Children of the Liverpool Streets, his plays Enter Queen Lear, Killing Time, The Attempted Assassination of Salman Rushdie, Lovers Are Not People, The Inquisitor, Hey Hero, his screenplay that he has written for the award-winning film Daira, which he adapted and directed also onto a stage play at the Leicester Haymarket Theatre as The Square Circle, continuing with his plays The Only Thing, Only in America, a TV documentary in 3 parts, and, as I said before, his latest novel Chanakya Returns, and also his novels have returned because his UK publisher has reissued his novels The Taj, The Imperial Agent, and The Last Victory online as well as in print by demand. And I am not out of breath because we want you to write more and more and more. Shri T.N. Murari, let me welcome you to stage to speak with us, the living legend, the Marathon Writer, in conversation with Sanjeev Chopra at the Chennai Literature and Art Festival 2022.
Thank you, Mamati, for that absolutely wonderful introduction. And she's already told you about the Marathon Writer and about the large number of books that he's written. Many of them have been translated, and I'm a fan of his. So and yesterday we had a conversation. I thought we should, because the range is so wide that it'll be difficult to encapsulate the entire thing in 60 minutes. What is most fascinating, friends, is the range of things that he's written about. You have people who are historians, people who are fiction writers, and they write on one particular aspect or one particular area, one particular era. Now, the beauty or the absolutely wonderful thing which I found in Mr. Murari's books is, that from Chanakya Returns, which is set in the BC, in the, before 2 millennia, to the last Cantagian, which is, almost a COVID-type situation. So what we'll do is that we will maybe go about it from a chronological manner, not in terms of when you wrote what, but in terms of a span of history. So let's talk about the book Chanakya Returns, because there is a sequel to this book, Chanakya Returns, which is going to come. And, Mr. N. Ram talked about Machiavelli. But even before that, there was this person called Chanakya who was able to define statecraft in a manner which is so fascinating. And in Chanakya Returns, he talks about the binaries of love and power. Who overpowers whom? Ultimately, of course, it's a question of power being the most dominant force. But there's always that contest between love and power. So may I request you, sir, to start a conversation with the binary of love and power, how you took up Chanakya Returns, and a little preview of what's going to happen to this sequel.
Well, the reason I wrote that was because I'm just studying modern-day Indian politics after so many years. That in one way, nothing changes in India. Betrayal and power are the two main factors that seems to drive our political machine. And Chanakya was an expert in politics. He knew how to manipulate power, how to manipulate kings. And he plots the path for a young woman to become a powerful politician. But at the same time, someone is very much in love with her. So the choice is between the power of love or the love of power. And often as not, we choose, many of us choose love, but others choose power, because that gives them that strength over other people. So in Chanakya, I wanted to explore his thoughts on modern-day politics and how he works the machine that we call elections, or what we call cabinets, chief ministers. He knows how to do that. And of course, I read up everything possible in Chanakya before I even began the novel. So the next part of it is I'm still working on, I should say. And it takes time sometimes to work number 2 when you finish number 1. So I wish I could tell you what it will be, but at the moment, I think I'm just going to say, you'll have to wait a bit longer.
Certainly. Certainly. We'll wait for it. Now, both Machiavelli and Chanakya, both of them, they had set their logic of power in the era of monarchy. We made a transition from monarchy to democracy. Do you think the nature of power has changed, or is the nature of power the same as it was from times immemorial? Is there something about power which will never change?
Power never changes. Might be a king with a crown, or a chief minister with a majority, or a prime minister with a majority party ruling a country, and they can do what they can or what they want to do. So in that context, power remains the same, whether it's the days of Ashoka, or the Queen Victoria, or even today. It depends. Power never changes. It is trying to control and trying to suppress other people. That is what power is. And that is why right through the history of man, we've rebelled against kings, we've rebelled against dictators, we rebelled against other forms of power that have controlled us. And this is what we are seeing now again, is how politically we keep changing. But at the end, power is always trying to control us and suppress us, which is like 1984 again. And this, especially in this technological age, that we see Elon Musk has now taken 3 journalists off Twitter because they criticized him. And that is his power, to silence. And the greater power up there is to silence as many people as they can.
Absolutely. So I think it's something to really ponder over. And I must mention here that Ashoka and Chanakya continue to be themes on which a lot of books continue to be written. In fact, another shortlisted book this year was Alan Seeley's book called Ashoka. And he spelled Ashoka with A-S-O-C-A. To give. And I must mention that one of the edicts of Ashoka is near the Kalsi, which is a forest in Dehradun. So it's nice to, So we move on now from Chanakya, and Chanakya returns to the Taj Mahal, which is, we're moving about 2,000 years. This is a lovely book, Taj, that he has written. This is a book which has been translated into 25 languages. All of us know the story of Mumtaz, and we know the story of Shah Jahan. But in this book, there are 2 fascinating characters. There's a character called Isa, who's a eunuch, and he is a narrator of sorts. I mean, he narrates the story after the death of Mumtaz. And there is Murti, the sculptor. So everyone would have known or would have heard about these larger than life heroes and heroines. So tell us about how was Isa created and about Murti, because I thought, we must share with our readers these 2 people who have really helped you to build the story together from the beginning to the end.
Well, I must first say that Taj was inspired by my wife. I took her to see the Taj Mahal, and I tried to give her a brief history of the Mughal Empire, and she said, that's just not enough. You don't know anything. So I had to go and research everything possible in order to tell her of the period.
So I think one sec, we must invite her to join us up here on stage. No? We can?
Yeah, she decided to stay there. And so I was living in New York then, and the New York Library is full of any book you want on the Mughals, they will get you from any place in the world. And so I researched Taj, and of course, you're asking me where Isa appears. It is in the Shah Jahan Nama that there is a sentence there that says, a man called Isa walked in the shadow of the great Mughal Shah Jahan. But about him, nothing else is known. So my Isa was there in virtually the first line of the Shah Jahan Nama. Of course, any building in India, as you all know, is done by migrant labor. Tomorrow's skyscraper here is done by migrant labor. And the Taj Mahal, of course, was done by migrant labor as well, whether it was just the work of putting bricks together or else carving the jali that surrounds Mumtaz's tomb. Because when I researched it back then, you could wander around the Taj Mahal without any barriers because nobody went there. And so I did have the chance to go below to see the tomb and to wander through the below rooms as well as the Taj. So I decided to make a migrant labor, since I'm from South India, a South Indian sculptor who is sent by his Raja to go and work for the Taj Mahal. And so he's the one who creates the jali around a very complex piece of work. And as I said, because of this migrant labor, if you look at who built the Taj, I mean, there are people from Persia, from Turkmenistan, but from India, and so there was a whole group of people, thousands of them, 22,000 I'm told, who worked on building this building.
20 years.
For 20 years. And so I wanted my South Indian character to be a part of the migrant labor that goes there, and he never returns home, as many migrants don't. And so he dies there, but his children continue to live on in Agra. So that is how it all came about, inspired by my wife, and then inspired by this character Murthy. I wanted him to be very much alive there. And, of course, Isa. So you know the connection between Isa and Murthy, which I won't explain here because it's part of the novel. So I was trying to use more ordinary people rather than the emperor and the empress.
I think that's a very important aspect of this book. It's not just about the love of the emperor with the empress, but it's also about the entire ecosystem of construction, the entire way in which, well, at one point there was a lot of regal love, but there was also exploitation at the same scale. Does Isa, the characters of eunuchs, does that lead you somehow to your film Daira? I mean, is there some link there? Because there's this wonderful, this film that you made in which a man is a woman and a woman is a man, And so how did this come about? Is there some link that you can draw from there? Because yesterday I felt, that perhaps there could be some link because you wanted to honor, and you wanted to celebrate the different kinds of sexuality that people may possess.
Yeah. Well, in all writers, there's a subconscious link that goes from book to book, novel to novel, or even non-fiction. And this Daira came out of an experience which inspired me, is that my wife's sister and I were driving around in rural Karnataka, and we stopped the car because I saw a very lovely village girl looking after goats, and it just made a great shot against the hillside and everything else. So I got out of the car, lifted my camera, and took a photograph, and she screamed, ran away, and 2 minutes later, about 15 men carrying hatchets came charging towards me. But luckily, my sister and my wife managed to calm them down, otherwise I'd have been hacked to death. But it turned out that many girls in that area were disappearing, and they were feared that I was here to kidnap this girl and probably sell her into prostitution or whatever it is. That when they told me the stories of the other girls that they never found, that sort of inspired me to write a story about a woman who's stolen and is trying to make her way back, and she's helped by an LGBT character. And he's dressed as the woman, and he says to her that to get you safely back home, I have to dress you as a man, because being a woman is very dangerous in the rural countryside. So that's how that whole story began. So the connection, I think, if you say it, is very subconscious. It's the fact that Isa is a eunuch and that there's multi-sexuality in the world. And this was written back in the 90s, long before LGBT became a popular theme in other people's works. So I was delighted that the film was well received, and Time magazine chose it as one of the top 10 films of the year. And of course, I was asked to direct it as a stage play in Leicester. And I had a very good actress, Panbanda Nagra, to play the role of that woman. And so that was a lucky stroke to have someone like her play the role.
So great. Now let's move on to two very interesting books that he wrote. That is at the turn of the last century. This is a continuation of Kim. Mamthi just referred to Kim. And therefore, he wrote two books, The Imperial HN and the last victory. Now, this is the setting, I think 1920s, 1910, 1920s, you know, when the empire is at its peak, when the empire thinks that, you know, it is, that the sun will never set on this empire. So tell us about these two books and your, I mean, how India is changing, you know, because if you look at, you look at Chanakya returns, you look at Chanakya, which is set in that period, then you come to the Mughals, and then you come to British India. So can you tell us about these two works which are equally wonderful and equally inspiring and carry on the legend of Kim?
Well, suppose between Kim and Taj, the two imperial powers. One was the Mughal imperial power, and the other was, of course, the British imperial power. Well, how that happened was I had read Kipling as a child, because at that time, when I was growing up, there were very few Indian novelists writing for children. I mean, apart from what you could get in Chandamama and other magazines, that's all I had with reference in there. So we had Kipling, and I did read his novel, Kim. And I hadn't planned to write a novel because I read that book as a child, but I happened to be in Buenos Aires having dinner with some people, and the lady I was sitting next to had never been to India, and we were just talking. And she suddenly said, "The only book I've ever read about India is Kim."
Okay.
So I thought that very strange. Here's someone 15,000 miles away, and the only book she'd ever known about India was Kim. So I thought that about it, and I began to research it. And of course, Kim is Irish, which puts him out of the British. I mean, the Irish were exploited, somewhat like the Indians, by the English. And he's an orphan, and he's a spy already for the colonel. And I wanted to write about the British Empire, which in 1900, under Queen Victoria, was at the very peak of its power. And you would not have thought that within 10 years, that the end of the empire was very much in sight. It is going to happen. And Kim becomes a part of it. It's a question of nurture and of learning how he is going to react when he sees the changes happening. Who is he going to serve? The British or the India that he loves? So that's how this one came about. And I do bring in real-life characters in all these novels, Gandhi, Nehru, and Ambedkar. They're all in the novel, scattered through it, as Kim moves through the political landscape of India changing very rapidly. And of course, the novel ends at Jallianwala Bagh, the second part of the novel, The Last Victory, which that point in Jallianwala Bagh was the end of the British Empire, metaphorically speaking. It lasted for another 20, 30 years, but the end was there.
Yeah, but the end of the empire is very clear.
Yeah, the end of the empire was there.
So in fact, one of the ways of looking at India's history from 1910 to 1940s would be these two absolutely wonderful books. You see, there's another friend of mine, Dipankar Aron, who's also been to the Mansarovar, like I have been to Mansarovar. He was very keen that I talk to you about limping to the center of the world, Mount Kailash. Yeah. So you can tell us about that journey, about that writing, and because I picked up that thing, you know, what your relationship with your father's agnosticism, and your you know, and still you were willing to travel, and your journeys to Mansarovar.
Well, I was inspired to go to Mansarovar because of an orphan boy that my wife and I had looked after, was adopted into Europe and was going to have some serious surgery. And there happened to be an advertisement in the paper saying, inviting people to, sent by the government of India, that to go to Kailash. And my sister insisted that I fill in the form and go to Kailash in order to pray for the child. He said, when you go there and you make a wish, it'll happen. And I was like my father, an agnostic. I mean, and I still am. And so I had a great many doubts about going to Kailash, just because my sister told me to. So, but anyway, I sent away the form. But unfortunately, at that time, I had knee surgery, so I thought I couldn't go there now because of knee surgery. And, but the government of India, once you start a wheel turning with the government of India, you find you can't turn it back. Because once I'd written to them, the government wrote back and said, you are now on the Mansarovar in September. And I wrote back and said, look, my knee's given me problems, so I might not be able to make it. So the government wrote back and said, please pay the money. So it's fascinating always dealing with governments, how you can never put it into reverse gear.
So this is a compliment to the government of India, right?
Well, I'm not sure whether it's a compliment, but what I'm trying to say is that the machine works. It's sort of... So I had to go to Kailash, and of course we had to, at that time, it was a matter of trekking about 200 kilometers, first to get to the Lipulek Pass. And this was in September, which was the very last, we were the last batch to go. So it was bitterly cold. And we crossed into Tibet and stayed in the place Takalot before going to Kailash. And as you start climbing Kailash, even at the Lipulek Pass, you can't breathe. You can take a breath, but you really have to suck air in order to just take another step. So in that way, it was a fascinating experience. But also the belief in Kailash, for us, for the Hindu religion, is the center of the world. And every religion has got a center of the world of one cave, whether it's Mecca or Jerusalem, or whichever one chooses. So in that context, Kailash has existed for so long. It's in our Ramayana that Hanuman goes to Kailash, brings Kailash back to save Bharat. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And so, even though I'm an agnostic, I'm still fascinated by the history of that mountain and the pilgrimages that have occurred and the stories behind it. And it was a wonderful experience of going to Kailash. And for the sake, not so much for my soul, but for this orphan who was going to go through surgery. And I think maybe going to Kailash, he came through it fine. It worked.
Great.
And he recovered immediately. And so sometimes it's just coincidence. Other times maybe something does work mysteriously in our world.
So, another thing about this book is that it also shows the infrastructure development that has taken place in Tibet and the stark comparison between our roads and the roads that are there. And at least now that many of our roads are coming up there, we have a warning from the MC. 5 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. 10 minutes is okay. Great. So, it's very interesting that he had written a book called The Oblivion Tapes. And that was almost a COVID-like scenario that you had drawn, I think 20 years ago, 25 years ago. Yeah, long time ago. And long time ago, he wrote a book called The Oblivion Tapes. And then COVID happens. And when you read the contagion, it is almost like, living in the COVID times. So books can have a great afterlife because of events which are absolutely unconnected, all connected to the time when they were written. So you could probably talk to us about the Oblivion Tapes, and about the reissue as the last contingent.
Yeah. I think I was reading a science textbook, and again, I think then I was living in New York. Quite a fascinating study on the spread of diseases, and it wasn't a research for any particular kind. It's just a friend had given me the books. So I was sort of reading this, and the thought came to me that everything, when you look back, there have been terrible plagues and epidemics that have wiped out millions of people over the thousands of our years. And one assumed that they're from natural causes, whether it's the plague in England in the 14th century, which killed half the population, or whatever. So I thought then that plague can also be man-made. It could be a plot by people to try and take over a country, or to try and control a population, or do something like that. And so that's how Oblivion Tapes came about, because as I was a reporter then, and in fact I just finished making documentaries, so I was quite familiar with equipment, so I brought the two together and made the main character a television reporter. And the country is unnamed, but it is a disease. Yeah, that it is a man-made disease or something that can wipe out a lot of the population. And so that was written then, and friends of mine who read it and said, you know, this is you shouldn't be writing this. I mean, this is not going to happen. But then, of course, as you know, COVID comes along. And it's man-made. It's not something out of a natural disaster of some kind or the other. It's certainly COVID is man-made, even though the Chinese deny it. And so people wanted to reissue my book, and I'm very pleased to do that, because it was written actually 40 years ago. So sometimes yes, you can't escape your past, especially in writing. Books that, I enjoyed writing it, but it was something I'd virtually forgotten. And suddenly publishers wanted to reissue it because of the COVID.
Yes, and it's done quite well.
So then I get paid again. So without writing another book, I make some money.
Right, great. I'm going to touch upon a subject which is very close to your heart and also to Maureen's heart. And I'm going to quote who had set the destiny in motion? What forces shape our lives? How do they work? It seemed so arbitrary. A chance visit from a few foreign women and his whole life had changed. Was that meant to happen? Was it foreordained that a particular time and place should bring his small, hopeless life into collusion with total strangers? I'm not a practicing Hindu, but at times the feeling and sense of karma controlling our lives overwhelms me. My temporary son, an orphan's journey. This is my last question, or the last thing I'd like you to comment on.
Well, again, I entirely blame my wife for this. She found a little orphan who needed some serious surgery, and for months carried it around in the car to find the right surgeon for it. And she brought the child after surgery. The doctor said, where are you going to put it? She said, well, back into Mother Teresa's nursing home. He said, no, if it goes there, it'll catch other diseases and it'll die. So he said, you should take it home, because that's a cleaner environment for about 2-3 weeks, and then you can return it to the orphanage. And in the meantime, we were trying to get the child adopted, at least Maureen was. So from 2 to 3 weeks, because the adoption process took so long, he stayed with us 11.5 months. And in that time, one falls in love with a child. And it is, as you say, in that this was a little child who was born near Pondicherry. Somebody had found it, and because of its physical deformity, had given it to Teresa's home. From there, it had come to Chennai. My wife happened to find it and had its surgery, and then he was adopted and went to live in Europe. So that's what I meant. How does one predict the destiny of anyone? Otherwise, this child would have been neglected and probably died, but the parents had cared for it enough and gave it to Mother Teresa in the hope that it could help, they could help in some way. So this child grew up in Europe, and we see him every year, and he comes and visits us every year. So he's very close to us. So in one way, even though I call the book my temporary son, he's in many ways our only son.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And on this note, thank you very much, Mr. Murari. Thank you very much, Maureen, because you've been a part of this journey, and without you, this journey would never have been completed. Thank you very much, Mr. Marathon Writer.
Thank you, Sanjeev.
It's been a pleasure.
It's a pleasure.
It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
A small token of our appreciation for your presence and every word that you have written, Sri Murari. I do have a question of you, though. May I ask you? Being a marathon writer, do you really take the time to relish the love and the love that is received and the success of your prior book before you move on to the next? Or are you too busy writing so as to not take time to savor success of one book?
Well, I don't go, I'm not a machine, so I don't go from one book to the next. I do take a break. And I have to think of what I want to do next. And that might take a week, a month, a couple of months. So I do escape my solitary life to enjoy the outside world in between books.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Vital information for all other writers too. Thank you.